So just to kind of set the contrast then over these 40 years, I've heard you say before, as you said earlier a few moments ago, that when you first started in Canada, that feeding cattle was very profitable. So give us a contrast of like on a per head basis, what was a profit target 40 years ago versus what would be a profit target as an average today?
Yeah. Well, we didn't really have a target, but the reality of it was that it was early in a new business in an area that had many natural advantages, right? So it was the return on equity was 30 and 40%, and on a per head basis, 40 years ago, we were making up to $200. So, I mean, just, if you put that in today's
Mm-hmm.
context, you'd have to be making $800 a head, right? So there was a very good return, but it was because we had the lowest feed grain prices in the world with barley production, and we were given an additional incentive by the government to use feed grains domestically. As opposed to export
Okay.
enhancement, they paid for domestic utilization.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was looking at one of the first closeouts of the cattle I was involved in 1984, and the net cost of the grain was $60 a ton, right? Well, it's pretty easy to make money when it's $60 a ton.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we had an abundant supply of feeder cattle, right? In a sense, an oversupply because we were sending lots of feeder
Yeah.
cattle to the US. And we had a shortage of high quality grain fed beef in Canada. So our basis was better. Our selling fat cattle were higher in Canada than
Right.
they were in the US. You had everything going for you, right? And in that time frame from the late 70s, early 80s to today, Alberta is growing into either the fourth or fifth largest, cattle feeding area in North America. They're very similar to Colorado. The numbers can flip flop between Colorado and Alberta in terms of, how many cattle are fed. So timing is everything in some respects. I was part of the very early involvement when cattle just made an enormous amount of money. And that's why, if you just kept pushing all your money in year after year, you grew from not much. You keep doubling, right? You get to a pretty big number in a hurry. And I did not stop to build feedlots and to acquire farmland. So my model was distinctly different than many of my customers and other people because they wanted to own the feedlot, own the farmland. And I'm thinking, man, what's wrong with owning the cattle? Right? Like there's massive returns into that, and the returns into the farming and the actual feedlot thing wasn't nearly as good. And in fact, the farming was horrible for many years. It was a decrease in working capital in many situations. So I avoided some of the things that producers typically, as producers, right, we typically like to, own our facilities and
Yep.
own our land and, all of this kind of thing. And it's that thinking that I was glad everyone else had that thinking because it allowed me on the custom side just to go full bore, and I never, ran out of places to feed the cattle.
So was
So that
custom feeding cattle at that time, was that really popular or did you have a difficult time finding?
no, not at all. In Western Canada, it basically all started with custom feeding,
Okay.
right? The feedlots didn't own
Yeah.
that big a share of the cattle, gradually. I mean, it changed dramatically over time. Right. But for the first 20 years, all the money was, well, there's a lot of money in the cattle, right? Just
Mhm.
so if you were looking at it strictly financially, like I was, you had no incentive for owning farmland or feedlots. But as the industry matured over time, then you don't have those massive returns. And so you had to get involved in cattle ownership to make the whole thing work properly. Right. And I still maintain you don't need to own the farmland. Others would disagree on that and say over a long period of time, it's okay. And that is true, right? Over a very long period of time, like a lifetime. I need cash flow. I'm looking at things that, can make significant amount more rate of return. Lands, tends to be a storage of wealth as opposed to generating
Generating wealth.
wealth.
Yeah.
And I've tried to grow and grow all the time. And therefore, The role of land in my portfolio is pretty minimal.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't own feedlots either if I didn't have to, right? Because of, you needed to get to scale. Feedlots needed to get very large. And also production got considerably more complicated over time. And quite frankly, not all feedlots were up to it, right? So
Right.
we own do very little custom, feeding now. All of our facilities, including calf ranches, calf depots, and various things we own. Again, just because we think that production is complicated enough, you've got to do everything right. And at times we find it difficult to get all of that on a custom basis.
So tell us maybe when you bought the first feedlot, what was it that tipped you over the edge to shift your thinking from kind of the asset light version of your model to no, we need to own the feedlot? What was the tipping point there?
The tipping point was when big downturns occurred and the assets got worth considerably less than replacement value
Right.
by then, right? So I was starting to read some of the success stories of other businesses and entities, and one of them has buy physical assets that are distressed. So every feedlot I've ever bought has been distressed to some extent. And where we made our significant move in the US, in the Texas Panhandle, that was post the financial crisis, and things were not good. Feedlots were trading at almost a quarter of their replacement value, if not less. So it seemed like a good time to buy. And that's, it's a harsh way of looking at it, but it's like a golf course, right? Who makes money on the golf course? The third or fourth owner.
Same
Right?
for most packing plants.
Yeah. Unfortunately true there as well.
Right.
Right. So they, all assets work depending on how you buy them. But it was not just because, they singularly because they were depressed. It was also because we wanted to fully control our own production.
Right.
So whether they were distressed or not, ultimately we would have still have owned feedlots.
Still would have gone there. So then just in terms of feeding cattle and navigating the commodity markets on the input and output side there, what were maybe one or two like really pivotal experiences in your journey that kind of shaped how you think about cattle ownership and managing risk, and maybe that is now informing how you're thinking even about Blackshirt?
Well, the first experience I had that was not good was in the spring of 1996. And what happened there was a contra-seasonally, April was the low of the market, and corn prices went north of $6, and feeder cattle went below $50, if you can believe that. So it was a very substantial wreck that occurred, and it was the first time it ever happened to me. We had a very clear runway where I had no comprehension or interest in risk management. I think every time you touched the cattle, you made money until you didn't, right? Which was the spring of 1996. So that was a watershed moment, because somewhere during that time frame, I would have been technically insolvent, which always gets your attention, right? Because just of a massive loss where all of my inventory was, it was concentrated in that time frame, because for the previous 20 years, that was the peak of the market.
Yeah.
Right. So pretty much everything that could go wrong went wrong, but it was an eye opener in the sense that you better be thinking about, how do you mitigate some of the risk here? What can you do? Because up until that point in time, I paid no attention to risk management of any kind, because your returns wide open in the cash market had been so good.
Was anyone else paying attention to risk management, or this was just, it was unnecessary for everyone?
Yeah, in Western Canada, I think because of the profitability, there was less emphasis on risk management. But certainly a lot of the people around me had been, as they got bigger and bigger, at starting to look at it.
Okay.
And they were counseling me to have a look at it as well. But of course, I was too smart for all of that, right? So I didn't listen very well. And it was a very scary experience, but a useful one in the sense that it, put in perspective what you needed to do to make sure that you don't become insolvent during a massive wreck. And then once I started looking at it a little further and getting involved in consulting in the US and seeing what was going on, I mean, they'd periodically had their share of these things occur, right? And they were much more, I guess, realistic in terms of what could, how bad the situation could get. And I think the second one, which was a black swan event that no amount of preparation could have helped, was the BSE event that we had here in Canada.
Right.
Where, where fat cattle prices got below 2 digits and our losses cash to cash on cattle, were north of $1,000. Right. So I mean the whole market collapsed because Canada, we're 50% dependent on exports, roughly 90% of which went to the US. So when the borders closed, we had way too many cattle, not enough processing space, and all of the things that led to a disaster on the price side. So I think that experience taught me that there are things that can come along. And the second black swan that we were all, we all got the COVID, right? So that was another black swan event. Mm-hmm. But what those things taught me is that you can be highly successful in doing what you're doing, but you're not bulletproof in terms of outside things that can come into play. So it really, I think what it does is it sets you up makes you more resilient so that you understand, I dealt with COVID a lot better than I dealt with BSE because that was version 2, mm-hmm. right, of a major problem. And then your mindset and how you deal with it, it doesn't create the levels of anxiety that you get on the first go around.
I can imagine. Is there, in any sort of commodity business, is there a way to be bulletproof?
Not that I know of. Right. I mean, when I hear those terms about any business, we're mm-hmm. bulletproof, we're this, we're that. And I'm thinking, you just haven't been around long enough to know what the black swan that will bash you over the head is going to be. Right. And by the same token, I've seen businesses that have had a large degree of success due to a white swan, so shall we say, and not really because of planning or, it was serendipity that led to success. And I've got no issue with that. That's good.
Yeah.
But as you better understand as the owner of the business, especially when you're thinking about expansion and so on, that how you got here was not, was just luck. And we all as humans have a hard time we all like to think our success is because we're so brilliant, but a portion of it is luck and timing, right? It's just, there's no way to escape that.
Right. Man, that's so good. So that seems like a good transition point then. So tell us, you had all of this experience, these decades in cattle feeding, decades consulting. How has that transitioned and led to Blackshirt Feeders? Tell us about what that project is. And
yeah, that's been a lot of fun. So throughout the 40 years, I've never been involved in a greenfield site, right? Never built a feedlot, but certainly bought many and sold many and saw a variety of operations, and always had in the back of my mind, it would be really great to synthesize all of this into a new site and try to incorporate all the best features of what you've seen over a long period of time. So we've been thinking about it, myself and my partners, for about 10 years. And a couple of things happened. One is that we ran out of feedlots that we could buy that were to scale. And in our minds, 50,000 is kind of a minimal scale that would interest me. Mm-hmm. As we've got involved in feedlots from as small as 5,000 head up to our largest site, which currently is 80,000 head. Very big economies of scale all along the way, right? So we could see pretty clearly there was a message that build them bigger and your OPEX is going to go down. right? That's just inevitable in the feedlot business that happens. And also, again, through consulting, fortunate enough to see some of the operations and work with operations in Mexico that are 200 to 225,000 at a site, right?
Wow.
So knew that making them really large, we were able to see that this OpEx trend continued. So we thought, well, we need to find a place that we can build. We're not able to buy anything we like. Well, then your only other option is to build. And the other unique thing about Blackshirt is it really represents the best physical site, all things considered, that we could find in North America, right? And the primary siting criteria of what's the corn basis, what's the weather, where are the packing plants, all of those things that you should think about, where and the irony is in many cases people built feedlots where they live, right? That's what happened here. I mean, there was no consideration of, as it turns out, this was a very good site here in Western Canada, but it started because people built feedlots where they lived. And if you were fortunate enough to start building them in the right place, then it resulted in prosperity and continued growth, just like the Texas Panhandle, right? From first principles, a pretty good place to build feedlots. And so the industry grew there. But there's also many feedlots that were put in areas that are pretty tough from the viewpoint of weather and packer location and all this kind of thing. So we set about studying where we would build for about a year. And that's how we came up with the site in Nebraska. Things like water availability, corn basis, all of the primary siting criteria it met. So I think it's one of the largest greenfield sites that was intentionally built in a location that the owners thought was ideal, right? And we're going to build that feedlot to 150,000 head.
Okay. And there are some other unique things about that business model, right? I mean, talk to us more about what type of cattle, what's the ownership structure.
Yep. Yeah, there are a few things again, by traveling around and watching what happens in other parts of the world, we got very interested in roller compacted concrete. And we had added that to some of the feedlots that we have here in Western Canada. And briefly, it's basically regular concrete at a third the price because of the way that it's rolled as opposed to placed in the conventional methods with rebar. So essentially, you get concrete at a third of the price. That got very, very interesting because you can use it to mitigate weather. And that's what allows you to put the feedlot in a location that you wouldn't have if you didn't have RCC, right, to get around the mud. So it's really helpful for mitigating the weather risk. And it's also a prerequisite if you're going to get involved with biodigesters. In order for the manure to stay clean enough, you pretty much have to put it on concrete. So remember I mentioned earlier that timing is everything. When we put our first RCC in feedlots in Western Canada about 7 years ago, we weren't thinking about biodigestion, right?
That was just for the economics of feeding cattle.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Driven by the performance of the cattle during adverse weather events, right, is going to pay for itself and also reduce maintenance and all of that. So it was strictly a feedlot reason for doing it.
Okay.
And then the world changed with RNG, where because of the carbon credits and because, everybody wants to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040 or pick a number, those entities that want to do that have no way of decreasing their footprint unless they buy credits, right? So it resulted in this whole industry emerging around RNG, both on the dairy side and also on the beef cattle side. The dairies were ahead of us because the gas is more valuable, right? Same animal, but it's more valuable because of the reduced emissions around a lagoon. So they're getting credit for that. So there was many, many digesters built in conjunction with dairy operations. And feedlot operations were, hampered by the fact that the manure on dirt floor pens, you just can't do it. But you could do it on RCC.
Yeah.
What we learned here in Canada was that now you can build a digester and you're creating a revenue stream from something that would normally be a cost center. Certainly a cost center here in Western Canada, even if you own the farmland, which we typically do not, right? So for us, it really is a cost center because we have to, get rid of the manure. So it allows us to, generate revenue from something that really has been more of a cost center than anything. And it gives you some other opportunities as well, right? Because this whole bioeconomy thing, I mean, the digestate that comes out is organic by definition. It has the same nutrient profile as what went into the front end. And, it opens up opportunities for developing organic fertilizer and, a whole host of other things. But it's really creating a revenue stream, an additional revenue stream for the feedlot. So that's been a pretty interesting aspect to be developing that approach. And again, very doable in that location because of the proximity to the gas infrastructure. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere,
right,
you're not building the digester because you can't get the gas into the pipeline. Right back to the primary siting criteria, when we were looking for that site, we needed to look where we're going to get the gas into the line.
And then the scale of the yard just makes the scale of the methane digester project all the more efficient, I'm assuming, as well.
Totally. There's a big scaling advantage in digestion as well, right? Not just the feedlot, right, but just bringing the whole thing to scale. The other thing that's unique about it is we have 5 other partners, including myself, into the operation, all of which have had, very experienced feedlot people over time. And someone could say, well, nothing good was ever built by a committee, right? But in this case, we had many sessions where we went through the ideas that were out there and our practical experience with the sites that we've been involved in. And I think that we built a feedlot that that represents the synthesis of all of the things that we've looked at over time. But the real downside of this, of course, is that since we're the builders, feedlots that we buy that they have features we don't like, we can't say, well, those guys did that. Now we have to look in the mirror. So we messed something up. If we messed it up, it's because we did it, right? And I'm sure there'll be something that doesn't turn out to be ideal. Is sort of the nature of progress, right? Over time, you never build anything perfectly, and hey, someone will come along and build a better one. That's just the way that
as
we
it should be,
operate.
Right?
Yep.
So before we leave the methane digester project, without getting into the specifics of the finances around it, do you guys own the methane digester, or do you have a partner in that, another company of some sort that is partnering and leading that? How does that work?
We're an equity partner in the facility. And again, that's just because we're trying to maintain good alignment between the two entities. Because, for example, what would happen if we found out that by picking up the manure more frequently resulted in better gas production, right? And there's a lot of data suggests that might be the case. Well, if we own the feedlot, only our incentive to want to deliver the manure more frequently is zero.
Right.
Right. So I think that it's really helped to bring a better alignment. And for example, when we were bringing in the electricity and the gas, to the site, then you've got another way of decreasing the cost of that infrastructure when you're spreading it over 2 larger operations. Right. So there's been a host of arrangements. I mean, there's companies that will come into dairies and do everything turnkey, right, and just pay them as off-takers for the manure. I think those structures are acceptable. But what we've really focused on and why our group has been successful over time is by trying to get the best alignment that you possibly can right out of the gate, right, so that we're both aiming in the same direction, and that for us, that's just been a better structure long term.
And is that this project, the economics of it,
Yep.
do they work even in the absence of anyone participating in a carbon market?
Absolutely not. Right. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at natural gas, and it's ran up here over the last few days for reasons I'm not sure of, barely over $3 an MBTU, whereas the price of the RNG stuff is typically tenfold on the low side, right? So,
Okay.
feedlot is $25 to $30 an MBTU, and the dairy stuff quite a bit higher than that. Some say 45 to 60. I mean, it's
Wow.
multiples of the actual burn value of the product.
Mm-hmm.
So the carbon market, right, because of scarcity, has created, it's a market driven thing to be sure,
Mm-hmm.
but the only reason why it exists is because on the ESG side, large entities have decided that they're going to become carbon neutral.
Yep.
If that goes away, then the price for the stuff will come down dramatically, right? So that's a risk that's inherent in the biodigestion world. But we believe that the whole business of ESG is not going away, right? That's our, regardless of our underlying philosophies, right?
Sure.
This train has left the station, right? If we believe that we're not going to try to decrease our carbon footprint, I think you're living in the wrong world, right? You're in denial of
Yep.
what's happening around you. And economically, that if people maintain those ideas, it's going to hurt them.
So you guys are well positioned.
We think so, right? Yeah, we've had lots of things didn't work out exactly how we thought over the years, but generally, directionally, we've been right most of the time.
So another big bet that you've made is around the whole beef on dairy space. So talk to us a little bit more about that side of Blackshirt Feeders.
Okay, just a little bit more of a background. I grew up in our ranch. We had Hereford seed stock. So my father started his purebred herd in 1943. So
Okay.
I was raised around seed stock and showing cattle and all
Yeah.
that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Never thought it would be much value as I've got into into the feedlot space, right? Because I thought, well, yeah, I know some cattle are way better than others, but phenotypically that's pretty hard to sort out,
Yeah.
right? And I'm just buying feeder cattle just like everybody else. They're in the witness protection program, basically. So I observed that over the years, made efforts to try to do alliances in the beef cattle sector, never really succeeded at scale. I think the biggest program we have would be about, with cow-calf operators, would be about 20 to 30,000 head into our system annually.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we know the sire of the calves, and we followed those calves through in a retained ownership program, and we've been able to. I mean, that's not much after 40 years of trying,
Yeah.
right? It's just a drop in the bucket of our feeder cattle requirements. Are those better cattle in average? Yes, they are, right? So, I mean, we're not in denial here that you can find better cattle. So when this whole Beyond D thing started to emerge, and basically it was 2011, I think 2010 or 2011, when it first started to think about this. It's not like it's new information that a native crossed with a dairy animal would be better than the dairy animal, right? I mean, everyone knew that,
Right.
but what catalyzed the whole thing was the emergence of sex semen.
Semen. Yep.
So suddenly now a dairy farmer can go after elite genetics to generate his next crop. And in most situations, they can have up to 40 to 50% of the calves can be bred to a beef bull. So suddenly you've got a whole population of animals out there that you can actually know what the genetics are. Right. So finally, I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. I'm finally going to be able to utilize something from, the involvement with seed stock that would be worthwhile here.
Yeah.
So I started to figure out, all right, how are we going to organize a supply chain so that we own the animals from birth all the way through the calf ranch, the feedlot, and so on, because that's the only way that you can monetize the thing properly and select the bulls that are doing the best job throughout the entire system. So I got very, very interested in that early because I thought now I've got a chance to materially create a supply that's significant in our population with, with known genetics, right? And not only known, but the ability to use best of or superior genetics
Yeah.
in those cattle. So, we got all over that right, in the beginning, and the B&D cattle will, today probably represent about 75% of our entire fed population, right? So we've been we've been working at it. Very, very exciting when you can line up the cattle and look at the various bulls, and you can literally create thousands of offspring from a single bull. And you can see pretty clearly, how it lines up to what your expectation was, and you can get involved in, the genetic side. And we have a partnership with Urus on producing bulls that we want for this B&D process. Urus, as you probably are aware of, have purchased Leachman, and that combination is producing the bulls for us on a proprietary basis, right? So the bulls that they're producing for us, the semen's not for sale elsewhere, right? So we have our own lineup of bulls that
Okay.
we've contracted them to, to build for us. So not only can you have genetic separation, you have separation that's sustainable, right? It's more of a pig model, right? Where you control
Absolutely.
the grandfather stock, right? That's how we looked at it. So very exciting. And this whole lifetime analysis is wonderful too, right? Where you can look at everything from birth and you can improve production in all areas that you're working because you have the data, right? And we also have the software and it's not like we had to go and build a bunch of stuff here. We already have it for tracking. We have very high powered data analytics and people to mine the information in this very large system. It really lends itself well to some of the newer things out there. We're looking at the application of AI with this massive amount of data to see where, can it give us further insights that are actionable or that are monetizable.
What are you
You
finding so far?
haven't had too many eureka moments with it, but we're in the early stages of training it, right? At least right now, it's coming up with the same conclusions that our more standard analytics have done. So it's reinforced well what we currently know or we understand. And in order to, take it to some of the next steps, you got to make sure that it can do what we currently do.
Right.
Right. So we're working our way through that. I think some of the first applications will actually come on things like I mentioned before, all of these images that come in on the necropsy side. I think AI is going to be able to make the diagnosis there, right? I think we're getting very close to being able to do that, and that's so handy because we consume a lot of DVM time in looking at images. It's a great training tool, but after you've looked at the first 100,000, you may have had enough of that too. So if AI can help us out there, I think it's going to be probably our first use case for the technology.
Make it faster, make it more precise, all of those things. Can you go back and tell us a little bit, Kee, how do you think about, so you talked about the genetics coming through Urus and Leachman cattle. How then do you think about setting up your supplier base of how are you getting those day-old calves and how are you making sure that they have the right genetics from Leachman
Yep.
cattle? What does that arrangement look like?
Yeah. Well, so we've got people that are calling on dairy farms across the U.S., setting up an arrangement where, they're going to be, we'll supply the semen and you put it in and you're going to get a bonus for, for doing that for every calf that you deliver. So we've incentivized them to sign up on the program, put in our semen, and we have various financial incentives for them to make that work. But as important as the incentives are, what's critical is that you've got enough horsepower to gather up the calves, right? You have to have calf depots at strategic locations so that the runners can go out and bring the calf, and then you can get those calves, transported to a calf ranch. So a lot of it is a logistical piece as well, right? You may be able to make a deal with someone, but do you have the ability to pick that calf up, 5 days a week? Right. So it's a logistical piece, plus it's a transactional piece with the dairy farmer. And as you're aware of, it represents a significant income stream for them now. When I first started buying day olds, they were $35.
What is that now?
Around 800. So it's become, a significant part of what dairies need to be thinking about. And it's, and there's roughly, you probably know this, there's about 9.5 million or so dairy cows in the US. So it always has represented a significant chunk of the fed cattle population in the form of a Holstein steer. Just as an aside, when we travel, some of the cow calf producers think, oh, this is going to cut into my market, right? Not really. They have one calf a year. It changes the genetics of it. And actually, it will create one of the biggest upsides for seed stock producers ever, right? Because the total addressable market's going to be about 6 times bigger than it's been in the past, right? Not that many, except for seed stock, not that many people AI. Well, in the dairy business, 100%. So now we've got a market for semen that's between 12 and 15 million. And if you look at the high priced bulls that are being sold now across the various breeds, guess what? They're being bought by large semen companies to facilitate the development of their beef programs. So I couldn't think of anything that's better news for a seed stock producer.
Right. And even in terms of like total fed cattle market, it's still not native cattle versus beef on dairy. It's that you're replacing what was previously a pure Holstein with a cross now. So same number of animals, just different composition.
That's correct. Yeah. And when they think about that, they figure that out pretty quick.
Yeah.
So it's not as if, and those numbers will fluctuate a little bit over time, because in the US, the milk price has been a bit ugly here for the last couple of years. And so they probably bred more to be on D than they typically do. And now that I see replacement heifers worth between 3,500 and 4,500, I know what's happens next. They're going to breed less to be on D for a round or two, right? I mean, that's just the nature of supply and demand markets. But overall, this number of cows has been amazingly steady for the last several years in the US, between 9 and 10 million. As we know, our beef cow herd has dropped considerably. So what is true is that the proportion of B on D is higher because the other population is a lot less, right? So I think people get the proportion mixed up with the absolute number.
Yeah, good point. Good point there. So it's amazing to me how your career has come full circle, and some of those early principles that made feedlot health so successful are now coming to bear in completely new ways and taking it to even further, I don't want to say extremes in a bad way, but just taking it to new endpoints there with Blackshirt. The thing that strikes me most about what you've done, Kee, across your multiple businesses is the business model innovation. So what are some of the principles that you try to keep in mind as you think about business model innovation?
Well, I think one of the primary things is, be data driven and science based, right? That making sure that I stick to that has been highly beneficial. I'll just use an example. I get approached quite a bit to invest in things outside of agriculture, right? And so I've listened to a lot of pitches about even within agriculture in the BC space. What I find is that once I get out of the wheelhouse of what I know something about, beef cattle, if I get outside of that, I'm in big trouble, right? In terms of being able to assess what people are saying and being able to understand, is this really a valid idea? Is this innovation something that, or perceived innovation, is it real? Right. Well, the only place I can assess that is right in what I know something about, and that's beef cattle and feedlot production. Right. And so what really helps me, stay in the right direction and come across, I'm looking for innovations in other sectors in the broad sense. And I think, how does that really apply to what I'm doing? Right. And the answer is very infrequently. Right? Because these innovations that truly are, and some of them are true innovations in other things, just really don't translate well into the beef cattle world. And the best example I can think of is that 41 years ago when I first started, the best way for pen checking was to get on your horse, separate out the ones that didn't quite look right, and bring them to the hospital and stick a thermometer to them.
Yeah.
Guess what? We do that today. That is still the best method, despite all of the technology that's been tried to be applied to this thing, right? And so, there's some very promising things in the last while in terms of the readable tags and cameras and various things. But at the end of the day, there is no innovation there to adopt that I can make money from today. But boy, there was a lot of, I can just see, and I watch people get very enthusiastic about some of the stuff and just pile money into it, right? And go, I know this is going to be an innovation. It's going to change the pen checking world. Well, something will eventually, right? Wearables have become a huge part of the dairy production, right? They fit there. That's worked, right? But how is this thing really going to work for me in the beef cattle sector? So I think we have to be careful when we're assessing innovation. And one thing to remember too is that primary innovation is somewhat rare. Where you make money day to day is in getting ideas that are out there and just making sure your execution and how you implement it is superior, right? That's the key thing. I take it back 41 years ago. In vet college, everyone was talking about herd health and production medicine.
Yeah.
Talked about for 10 years before I graduated. That wasn't my primary idea, right? It was not my idea, but I figured out how to implement it, right? So I said, there's the idea. I like that idea. I can make it work. And sometimes people get confused as what was the innovation and who was the innovator. A lot of times, who took advantage of it wasn't the primary innovator of the ideas. Right. It's just, so sometimes you can hardly remember who it was or where that primary idea came from.
Yeah.
Someone asked me here, one of the vet students that was around on rotation said, how did you get the idea to charge on a per head day basis? That seems pretty interesting. And I'm thinking, can't remember that. I'm not sure if it was my original idea or not. I can't even remember. But a lot of people think it was, right? Because I was the first person here in Canada that made it successful. But honestly, I couldn't tell you if that was one of my primary ideas or not.
But it seems like that just makes the case even more of exposing ourselves to outside ideas from other industries, other geographies, other proteins. I mean, even when you were talking about that you had seen a 200 or 250 head, 50,000 head feed yard in Mexico, I didn't realize there was feed yards that large anywhere. So it's super interesting then even to see borrowing that concept and implementing it.
Yeah, well, it really helps you de-risk what you're doing, right? Because then you know that a feedlot at that scale has been successful, right? You make yourself a lot better sleeping at night when you're about to spend the amount of money that you're not doing something that's just isn't going to work or just doesn't make sense. So, traveling to me and not only looking at, beef cattle production operations, but any opportunity that I have to look at an agricultural operation anywhere on the planet, I'm going, right? That's because there's, whether it's grape farmers in California or there's always something that you should be able to take a thing or two out of what you're seeing and think about, does this apply? Or let's think about if it does apply, and then ultimately we'll likely have to test whether it's the right idea or not. And with our large research infrastructure, we can, take some of those ideas and get them tested before, they end up costing us a lot of money, right? Because on the surface, it looks like a cool thing or the right thing to be doing. A lot of times it's not, and you would have no way of knowing that unless you looked at it pretty carefully.
Wow. Well, that's such a good note for us to end on, because I know I've gotten multiple takeaways from the discussion, and I know the Future of Ag listeners will as well. So Kee, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Janette, and we'll look forward to visiting with you as we travel, because you have the habit of showing up in very interesting places. Okay. So very good. Have a great day. Thank you.